When I watched movies as a kid, I always liked the villains over the heroes. Heroes to me always seemed so boring, while the villains appeared cool, clever, dark, mysterious, sexy. Take Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader, for example. Which one seems cooler? Which one seems more badass? A silly farm boy on a sandy planet, or a Dark Lord under a mask with an intimidating voice and is commander of an entire fleet? Obviously, Darth Vader, right? If you chose Luke, then I don't know what to tell you. I guess you're not a cool kid. I guess you don't know what cool looks like. It's not even that I don't like the heroes. The heroes are great and I'm glad they win, especially because the villains that I like so much are truly evil and they deserve to lose. It's just the villains are cool. Like the dark side is the cool side. I don't know. There's just something exciting and thrilling about evil. Actually, one of my favorite movies as a kid was Star Wars Revenge of the Sith. And the only reason why I would really watch it would be for General Grievous, Darth Sidious, and Darth Vader at the end. That's it. I wouldn't watch it for like the story, especially because Anakin can be so annoying.
It's all Obi-Wan's fault. He's jealous. He's holding me back.
But for General Grievous, oh yeah, I would watch the movie for that. And I also remember when the Star Wars cartoon in 2003 came out between Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith. The cartoon General Grievous in it was so freaking cool. I mean, he was my favorite villain ever. Like he was just, the way he brutally and callously and unapologetically killed the Jedi to me was just like the coolest thing ever. Evil is just exciting on screen. And so the other thing about villains that I've noticed, and this is kind of an obvious observation, but a lot of them laugh. It's a trope, right? Like the evil laugh.
Yes, excellent.
Villains just seem so happy. They seem to be really enjoying themselves. And so it just makes me wonder if I'm missing out on something, right? You want the hero to win, but to me, I just think like, why would I want to be the hero? The villain looks way more cool and exciting, I'm rooting for the villain most of the time because the villain actually seems to be enjoying himself while the hero looks like he's struggling a little bit. Anyway, about half a year ago, I got a job as a bookkeeper and I basically handle money every single day. And it occurred to me that I could steal hundreds of dollars and get away with it. Like I could just take money and no one would do anything about it because I was the person responsible with the money. And then I just wondered if I should actually steal the money. It became a really interesting moral and philosophical question to me because morally and intuitively, I knew it was wrong, right? You just don't steal things. That's not what you should do. Stealing is bad, so you should just not do that. But intellectually, philosophically, I really didn't know why stealing was bad, especially if you could get away with it, right? If you could steal and only benefit from it, why not steal? Does it pay to be evil? That's the question that I want to talk about today. A great book that helps to answer this question is Plato's Republic. Not only is it fundamental to Western philosophy and literature, but the essential theme that underlies this text is justice, which is exactly what we're talking about. Because at the very beginning of Book 1, Socrates gives arguments for justice against Thrasymachus. And if you don't know, Socrates is a famous and wise philosopher who is the main character in Plato's works. And Thrasymachus in this book is a sophist, and he basically argued that, and Thrasymachus basically argued the opposite, where he said that power and injustice is more profitable than justice, right? People who are just are losers, right? They lose at the end of the day. And so Socrates, being the wise philosopher that he is, thoroughly embarrassed him by making him blush. And so Thrasymachus leaves book one totally embarrassed. But Glaucon, on the other hand, who was an intelligent interlocutor of Socrates, wasn't convinced by Socrates' arguments. So he posed a really important thought experiment, which we will be talking about throughout this essay today. This thought experiment steelmans the unjust position. He had Socrates imagine a shepherd who discovered a powerful ring called the Ring of Gyges, which allowed him to turn invisible at will. And with this invisibility power, he became a messenger of the king, which allowed him to seduce the king's wife, kill the king, and then take over the kingdom, right? So this ring grants you any kind of power that you want. It allows you anonymity and immunity to your consequences, to your evil or unjust actions. And it's kind of a disturbing thought experiment because if someone had this power, there's nothing really there except morals to stop someone from being unjust. It appears that it indeed pays to be evil if you can get away with it. And so for the rest of the Republic, Socrates responds to this by going overboard by imagining a perfectly just city, which to me fails to refute Glaucon's thought experiment. For one, it seems like an extreme response to the possibility of injustice. This is understandable because if people could actually get away with whatever they wanted, and Plato was incredibly distrustful of people, it only makes sense to create a blueprint for a totalitarian dictatorship that regulated and censored people to goodness. But as a libertarian, I stopped reading at about the middle of the Republic because Socrates was going on and on about guardians and philosopher kings, which were the antithesis to freedom. And also because I feel like the Republic, there's too much in the Republic to unpack here. So I only really want to focus on the thought experiment by Glaucon, the Ring of Gyges. So Socrates gave a convincing argument already in book one. I just think the argument needs reinforcement and reinterpretation. Socrates argued that people of different professions didn't want to outdo one another. I interpreted this as not wanting to manipulate one another or get power over one another. For example, a doctor isn't concerned with appearance as a doctor or seeking rewards as a doctor. He merely wants to heal the sick. The good and the clever are people that don't focus on outdoing, while the unjust and the ignorant focus on outdoing one another. Furthermore, he said, could you use anything other than ears to hear, or anything other than eyes to see? I interpreted this as one must perform the proper virtues to achieve one's values. Without ears, one cannot hear. It might be possible to pretend to hear by feeling the vibrations with your hands or wearing cat ears or something, but at the end of the day, without the virtue of human ears, one cannot obtain the true value of hearing. So going back to the Ring of Power, or the Ring of Gyges, although it may grant the ring bearer anonymity and immunity to consequences, it doesn't grant them true virtues and values, only illusions. It only appears to grant values and virtues, but appearance is not the same as actually having a value. And that is why injustice is evil and why it doesn't pay, because one doesn't actually get what they want. A ring bearer, as a false doctor, may be able to convince everyone around him that he healed the sick, may receive rewards for healing the sick. But unless there is a true doctor to practice the virtue of medicine, sick people will die and the value of good health will be lost. People have real values that they care about, and no amount of illusion and deception is going to satisfy this need for values unless there is true virtue to back it up. And this especially applies to the example of sick people, because people's lives are at stake. And so I feel like a lot of people might be saying, but there's no consequences to one's actions, right? That's what the thought experiment is implying. But to me, I would say that's not how reality works. there's always consequences to a person's actions, right? Without consequences to a person's actions, the world would be rendered meaningless and nihilistic. In order for people to be deceived by an unjust doctor, they would have to prefer anti values or false values over true values. They'd have to believe that their sick loved ones not being healed would be a good thing, or act as if their sick loved ones were healthy, or turn their attention away from important values like good health for trivial values that hardly matter at all. And depending on how often the ring was used, in other words, the more people engaged in deception or allowed deception, the more hellish the world would be. Granted, some deception might be possible to get away with. In fact, deception without the ring of Gyges in our modern world happens all the time. But the reason why the world keeps functioning is because it's ultimately based on truth, and people generally achieve their values. But if there was an actual ring, and if the ring bearer decided to exploit the entire world, if he allowed himself to indulge his vices endlessly, the world would surely collapse. And so if I had the ring, I would hold it in contempt, since I would be wise enough to understand that its only purpose is deception or fabrication of fake values, and would be completely useless in the pursuit of authentic values. And authentic values are the only thing that makes life worth living. Although Thrasymachus lost to Socrates in the Republic, that doesn't mean some people don't echo what he believes. Many later influential people have sided with him. There are two books that instantly come to mind that make a strong case for being unjust or pursuing the ring of power. Those two books are The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli and The 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene. Machiavelli unapologetically wrote in The Prince, "Any man who tries to be good all the time is bound to come to ruin among the great number who are not good." And so, as expected, many people have criticized these books for being psychopathic or amoral. But to their credit, it doesn't come off as though they want to be evil. It's more as though they're pulling back the curtain behind morality. Green says that what separates us from animals is not our rational souls, as something Socrates would say, but our ability to lie and deceive. In fact, he would probably say that Socrates is attempting to deceive and play games like the rest of us by hiding behind the soul and justice. As Robert Greene says, to some people, the notion of consciously playing power games, no matter how indirect, seems evil. They believe they can opt out of the game. You must be aware of such people, for while they express such opinions outwardly, they are more often among the most adept players at power. So, if you haven't made the connection yet, the Lord of the Rings fantasy story by J.R.R. Tolkien is very similar to Glaucon's thought experiment. Even though Tolkien strikes me as someone that would side with Socrates, anyone that came in contact with the ring falls prey to it, or at least had to execute great temperance. Only extremely wise characters like Gandalf and Galadriel were able to refrain from taking it. The ring in both stories suggests that evil exists on a kind of metaphysical level, in all cracks and crevices of reality, and I think Machiavelli and Greene are here to tell us that. The power game is here, and anyone, even if they are good, are still very much a part of the game. And because this power game is part of the world, Machiavelli and Greene suggest that being able to play the game really well leads to positive results. They provide numerous examples in history where being evil has actually resulted in benefits rather than losses. So, for one example, Machiavelli points to a duke that took over a place called Romagna and put Romero de Orca under its control. Hopefully, I'm saying that right. And Romero's cruelty established order, and once that order was maintained long enough, the Duke had him cut in half. So the next morning, everyone saw Romero's body, bloody body, and people were appeased and stupefied by this. Of course, killing is evil, but Machiavelli has no problem with it because it's actually useful for maintaining power. Sure, Socrates and justice might sound really nice, it might be ideal, but it's not really effective. However, Machiavelli wrote The Prince in the 1500s, so killing and leaving people up for display may not float in the 21st century. But I'm sure people may tolerate different kinds of injustice depending on our culture today. And even though The Prince is a very old book, I still think it's incredibly relevant because where there's human emotion or vulnerability to deception, doing bad things can often result in good consequences. Green, on the other hand, even though was influenced by Machiavelli, saw his idea as more of a power as an individual power, like Nietzsche's will to power. His motivation for writing his book was, ironically, he saw a lack of honesty and power games being played in various jobs that he worked. So he wanted to write a book that exposed what was really going on. Especially after working in Hollywood, he said that instead of being upset at the lack of injustice in the world, it's better to understand and learn the game that's being played. So you could say that learning to be evil is more as a defense or a way to protect oneself, right? It's not about deliberately being evil, it's just more kind of like seeing the world for what it is. The world is kind of an evil place. And so it's just important to be aware of it, and you're going to have to participate in it if you want to succeed in life. About a month ago, Elizabeth Holmes was tried and convicted for her fraudulent company Theranos, where she convinced the public and investors alike that it was actually possible to run over 200 tests with a few drops of blood. This story is a convenient example of a person that accumulates a lot of power but inevitably fails because they don't have the virtue to back it up. What's amazing is that she managed to keep the deception going for over a decade. At one point, the company was worth $9 billion. In a sense, evil does pay, but I think it's only because the people surrounding her lacked virtue. Since I define virtue as being able to authentically pursue and maintain one's true values, a lack of virtue is someone who is not only a person that is deceptive, but deceives themselves in the pursuit of values. So looking at the investors on the board of Theranos, all of them were powerful socially, but they weren't qualified to see if the Theranos products actually worked, which is what allowed Holmes to fool everyone. And I would also say Holmes fooled herself in a sense as well, because since she believed she could change the world with only one college semester of chemical engineering, right? From a bird's eye view, one has to wonder what these people were doing, right? What kind of game was it that they were playing? How absurd it all is to see so much talk and money going around, yet having nothing authentic to show for it. All these people wore a piece of the ring on their finger, and it blew up in their faces. Even with the illusions and the lies that Elizabeth Holmes concocted, the only reason she was able to maintain the charade was because of third-party companies like LabCorp, right? These companies actually possessed true virtue because they were able to perform real blood tests on patients' blood. Without them, Theranos wouldn't have been able to exist at all. I mean, it would have just been completely impossible to keep the charade going. And so I would say the biggest failure in The Prince and the 48 Laws of Power is that they only focus on social power. It's never about the cultivation of one's values, but instead always focused on the emotions, feelings, appearances, and perceptions of people.
Because I'm a people person.
There's only 4 laws in the 48 Laws of Power that aren't exactly connected to deceiving other people. All the other laws, as far as I'm concerned, are a deliberate attempt to deceive and manipulate by playing on the emotions of other people. Even with these 4 laws, Green didn't like them for their ability to be virtuous or the generation of values, but for their ability to be others. For example, I agree with law number 9 that it's much easier to win through one's actions than argument, but he frames it in terms of deception. The example he gives for law number 9 is Michelangelo was arguing with the Pope about how to paint a painting, and instead of trying to convince the Pope that he was right on how to paint it, he cleverly painted it the way he wanted it anyway. And the Pope, without realizing that it was painted the way Michelangelo wanted it painted, actually liked the painting anyway. So Green provides an example showing how deception can be used for good results. But to me, this isn't a good law because it saves oneself from a petty argument with a dishonest person. It's a good law because a true value was created that any authentic person can genuinely see and desire, right? A good painting is a good painting. And I feel like you don't really need to deceive someone. You just need to paint the painting to show someone that it's a good thing. Going back to Elizabeth Holmes, her professor, Phyllis Gardner, someone she first sought advice from when coming up with ideas for Theranos, in my opinion, seemed to be the most powerful person in all of the deception and chaos. Gardner demonstrated true power because she was an expert in fields of medicine and engineering, which allowed her to create much wealth and power for herself. In the documentary that I watched, all the money that she created with these businesses made for an odd morality, but to me, I think that's a good morality. She was able to start many successful companies, help her students create many successful companies themselves, making them millions of dollars, and also allowed her to see through Holmes's deception. If Holmes would have actually simply taken advice from her professor, her honest advice, instead of detaching from reality with lies and illusion, I speculate that she would have ended up quite successful. In fact, it's always so strange to me when people go through so much trouble to lie, manipulate, and deceive when they could have just buckled down and learned an actual skill. It's much better to invest one's time into something sustainable and honest instead of faking one's way with deception. But Holmes couldn't accept her lack of virtue and expertise in the field and didn't want to go through the trouble to develop her skills. She turned to lies and deception out of weakness and impatience. Funnily enough, I think Robert Greene has caught onto this virtuistic kind of power over social power because he has an entirely separate book called Mastery, where he walks you through the painstaking steps to becoming a master of a craft, and that developing a skill is the greatest power a person can do. I honestly believe that the ideas in Mastery will make one far more powerful than all the laws combined in the 48 Laws of Power. In Glaucon's thought experiment, Glaucon wanted to pose what a just person would do if they were stripped of all of their possessions and status. They would immediately take the ring because they would receive all of their wealth back. But as I've described above, stripping a virtuous man of his wealth and power is a contradiction because actually they go hand in hand. People that produce authentic values are guaranteed to make money and rise in status in some way. Actually, Greene refers to this directly with law number 11, keep people dependent on you. Again, Greene frames these laws in terms of deception, but on the positive side, people will always depend on those that have skills and expertise. Power naturally comes to virtuous people without manipulation or coercion, and power will always come to them whether they want it or not, because a virtuous person is indispensable to a business or a relationship. They are so important for creating values.
I guess you just don't know people as well as you think you do. You miscalculated. I love Zuko more than I fear you.
If one masters people, they will get nothing. But if one masters reality, they will get both reality and people. However, to completely ignore the realm of social power would be a mistake. It's really easy to talk about virtue, and acting it out is much harder. Life is a combination of good and evil, wearing masks, pursuing false values, and playing games. Morality is often a gray and ambiguous subject, not cut and dry into black and white. So, how do you really know which of your values are authentic? How can you know if someone is actually deceiving you? right? Because the world is a modern jungle, and as much as I hate to admit it, social power does have some utility, and it's necessary to participate in. Sure, politics may be inauthentic, but politics is necessary, and again, the reason Machiavelli is read is because he looks at politics practically. Social power, even though it's false, I would argue it's mostly false and completely devoid of virtue, it's still important. Green says, yeah, another way of avoiding the game would be perfect honesty and straightforwardness, since the main techniques of those who seek power are deceit and secrecy. But being perfectly honest will inevitably hurt and insult a great many people, some of whom will choose to injure you in return. For some weird reason, it reminds me of the woman who asks, "Does this dress make me look fat?" And it's honestly one of the hardest questions, because what are you supposed to say to it? If you're honest, she'll get mad and punish you. But if you lie, then you'll be able to preserve the peace. But then you'll be considered evil for lying. Right? So it's like, it feels like a situation where you can't win. Although one could say that the woman asking this question is dishonest to begin with. Lying to her about how she looks is merely reflecting back to her own delusion. If she truly cared about her weight, she wouldn't ask someone else. She would just get it under control. But because this cliche example feels so common to me, it suggests that humans lie and deceive and play games all the time, probably without realizing it. I would also take it a step further and say that even people who think they're being honest are often lying to themselves and other people. And just because the lady said, "Does this dress make me look fat?" doesn't necessarily mean she cares about her weight. She could be saying it as a joke, right? She could be saying it because she needs genuine input, because she has been working on her weight, right? Some dresses are different from others and look different on different people, right? It's honestly pretty difficult to navigate these situations. And so, again, ironically, Green and Machiavelli are helping us find more authentic values and virtues. But again, where I deviate from Green and Machiavelli is when they seem to say that power and deception certainly exists. Morality is a power play, so we should double down on power and deception. At the very beginning of his book, Green says, "Not having power is miserable." This is certainly true if we throw ourselves into the realm of politics and Hollywood. There are many cases not only similar but much darker to the lady who asks, "Does this dress make me look fat?" Since these places are so devoid of authenticity and honesty, the only source of goodness is having power over others. The idea or the question of acting on deception is an indicator that one is in a kind of hell. There's this really great play called The Tragedy of Dr. Faustus, written by Christopher Marlowe, and like Lord of the Rings and Glaucon's Ring of Gyges thought experiment, it revolves around the concept of power. Basically, the main character, Dr. Faustus, sacrificed his soul to the devil to have all the power in the world. And there's a really interesting scene where Faustus asked a demon if hell exists and where it is. The demon is not only confused because, well, if you're a demon, you're direct evidence of hell, but he also says that hell is everywhere, within the bowels of these elements, where we are tortured and remain forever. Hell hath no limits, nor is circumscribed in one's self-place, but where we are is hell, and where hell is, there must we ever be. And to be short, when all the world dissolves, and every creature shall purified, all places shall be hell that are not heaven. And it's so funny because Faustus responded to this simply saying, "Well, hell doesn't exist." To me, it suggests that when people act on evil and deception, they don't know how bad things actually are. If you're making deals with demons, participating in deception, playing power games, sure, you may have a lot going for you, but you have to admit something is wrong. You have to admit you're not in a good place. Deciding to act on deception means one is already unhappy.
Happy people just don't shoot their husbands. They just don't.
In Lord of the Rings, Gandalf and Galadriel were tempted to take the ring, for example, but it's not like they really needed it. Even though they were wise and able to see, they were also powerful and wealthy already. Again, goodness and virtue is a power, so the ring doesn't make any sense for them to take. Why would Gandalf and Galadriel want to deceive anyone? People do not pursue power because they are happy and content and because they're in a good position. They pursue it because they are desperate and weak. When we give in to evil, especially out of desperation and unhappiness, on the one hand, being invisible and deceiving everyone gives someone great power, but their life becomes dualistic. They can't show their true selves. They can't be authentic. That's why I think it's a bit funny when in Glaucon's thought experiment, the shepherd seized the throne and married the king's wife like nothing happened. Sure, he was able to do bad things and get away with it because he's invisible, right? You're immune from consequences, right? That's the whole point. But wouldn't it be pretty obvious that the shepherd killed the king, especially after marrying the king's wife? Like, wouldn't you see the shepherd on the throne and be like, hey, what's he doing on the throne the next day after the king died? To me, it's like, are people dumb? Like, can you not see someone took the throne? I don't know how anyone can get away with murder and expect everything to be all fine and dandy, right? Like, there's a consequence to these things. Again, people are saying, well, you're missing the point, but to be freed from one's consequences creates a whole other kind of consequence, right? This reinforces how dualistic the whole thing is. It reveals how it reveals a kind of dualistic misery to being evil, because in order to fend off reality, to maintain any kind of deception like murdering someone or taking the throne, you're going to have to resort to more tricks and deception to maintain that level of power that you have achieved. Essentially, a false self or an evil self would arise as a direct contradiction to the authentic good self, right? The shepherd would have to be a faceless king. He would have to wear the ring all the time, right? He would have to be invisible all the time. He would be in an empty marriage. He wouldn't be able to rule with his real self. He'd have to rule with as kind of like a ghost to me. I think that's what he would have to do. It'd be ruled by a kind of god or something. Like this mystical force would obtain the throne rather than a real human being. If you're not a real human being, it creates a lot of mental anguish and suffering in yourself. And unfortunately, in Glaucon's thought experiment, we don't get to see what this does to a person's psychology. But in Lord of the Rings, we do see it. And arguably, the most important character in Lord of the Rings is Gollum for this very reason. Because Gollum had a direct and compulsive and obsessive connection to the Ring of Power. Or should I say Smeagol? I'm not sure which name to use because he's literally two people living in the same body. Gollum was split into two separate personalities with different goals when he came in contact with the ring.
Precious, false. They will cheat you, hurt you, lie. Master's my friend. You don't have any friends. Nobody likes you. Not listening. Not listening. You're a liar. And a thief. No.
One side, or the evil side, wanted power, and the other side wanted love. Setting aside the fact that Gollum spent centuries all by himself, alone and isolated, being deformed into a wretched creature, clearly Tolkien thinks that giving into power leads to a horrible existence. He also struggled tirelessly with his darker half, right? So there's this inner psychological battle that was taking place. And in general, not in just Lord of the Rings, there are so many villains that struggle with their light and dark half. In a very classical example, there's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And a more modern example that every time I see Gollum and Smeagol, I always think of the Green Goblin and Spider-Man. Do I want power or do I want love? Do I want to be deceptive and in control, or do I want to just be a generally good person, right? Like, I feel like you can't, every time someone gives into deception, you're going to create these two faces. And so, anyway, Frodo saw Smeagol while Sam saw Gollum. It's interesting because as they get closer to Mordor, as the ring grew stronger and the setting around them started to look like actual hell. And to me, this represents a race to the bottom, right? So while each of them tried to achieve power over people, as the ring made them more paranoid and more deceptive, as virtues were replaced with vices, they were slowly descending into hell until they literally reach Mount Doom, and then the evil collapses, right? The ring was, to me, the ring suggests that evil collapses on itself, because the only way the ring was actually thrown in, because Gollum and Frodo were fighting over it, right? Like, the ring, in a sense, kind of killed itself, because, well, if evil is so deceptive, and if everyone's lying and manipulating each other, what's going to happen? Well, everything's going to collapse around them until you get to a point where you realize we can't be evil anymore. We actually have to be honest and authentic if we want to build something real. And in another book called Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky, the main character, Raskolnikov, commits a crime in which he kills an old lady to steal valuables. And the old lady isn't a very good person. She abuses her niece, and with all of the money that she collects, she doesn't do anything with it, even though there's plenty of people around her that could use the money, that are in desperate need. And so Raskolnikov is also desperate for money because he's practically starved and doesn't have the funds to pay for his schooling as a law student. And to pay for his schooling, his mother and sister have been sending him money, especially his sister, because his sister planned to marry a rich man to help fund his schooling. And so with Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky sets up a story where the main character has a very good reason to do evil. It seems like this is a case where deception and the pursuit of power might actually be a good thing if you want to use the ring for good. However, before and after Raskolnikov commits the murder, he's in a state of constant suffering and insanity. In the beginning of the book, we realize that he spent most of his time in isolation while deliberating and wondering if he actually wanted to go through with the murder. And even though he thought rigorously about the murder process, we could say that he utterly failed executing his plan. For one, he killed the niece unintentionally. After he killed the old woman, he didn't realize the niece would be there, so he had to kill the niece too. So that was already a failure, right? He killed an innocent. So by being deceptive, he unintentionally hurt an innocent person. Second, he barely got away with the murder. So when he was about to escape, two men were on the outside of the old woman's apartment, so he couldn't leave until the two men outside decided to leave. But luckily, because the two men weren't really smart, they decided to leave, which gave Raskolnikov the chance to escape. So Raskolnikov got away with his deception, luckily. It was a very slim chance that he was lucky enough. So that's the second reason why he failed. And then the third reason was Raskolnikov didn't even use the money he stole. All of the valuables he stole from the old lady's chest and other places in the apartment, he just buried them behind a building. He didn't want anything to do with the stuff that he stole because he already started to feel so guilty, and so he just couldn't believe what he was doing. And so the overall message of this book is that the punishment for committing this crime wasn't getting caught. It's not getting thrown in jail. The crime itself was the punishment. It's the mental suffering that you have to endure for being a power-hungry person. And one of the main reasons Raskolnikov acted out this murder was because he was inspired to be like Napoleon. And Napoleon was this ruthless dictator who was very, very powerful. And so if Napoleon could do it, if Napoleon could be kind of like this superhuman being that could be able to do what he wanted to do for the good of humanity, Raskolnikov thought, well, I should be able to do it as well, especially if it's to the benefit of mankind. And similarly, I think the reason why the 48 Laws of Power is so successful as a book today is because people fantasize about how powerful and cool they'll be by following these laws in the same way that I watch supervillains on TV. But when one actually opens this book, it's actually quite difficult to implement, right? Because the 48 laws is a pretty large number, and I remember as an edgy 16-year-old trying to memorize all these laws and feeling that it was a bit pointless. Many of the laws seem to contradict each other, especially because there's a reversal at the end of each chapter, giving a warning of how practicing a law too much can reduce power. So, are these actual laws or are they tips? Couldn't these laws be condensed? How do you juggle all these laws in your head? How do you practice them all correctly and consistently? It feels like Green is expecting people to be these calculating machines executing things flawlessly, when actually most people are like Raskolnikov, missing subtle details because life is far too complex and nuanced to manipulate things to one's advantage.
I never expected this from you.
I guess you just don't know people as well as you think you do. You miscalculated. I love Zuko more than I fear you.
No, you miscalculated! You should have feared me more!
It seems to be much easier to simply focus on authenticity and honesty instead of playing all of these power games of deception. You know, the other thing that's really interesting in Crime and Punishment is that there's many references to the color yellow. And right, like there's the yellow walls, there's the yellow faces, and yellow is often associated with youthfulness and intellect, but also mental insanity, which perfectly describes Raskolnikov, and by extension, Elizabeth Holmes. Many people that aspire towards deceptive power, I think, tend to be clever and youthful, but are psychotic. Although one can object and say that Crime and Punishment and Lord of the Rings are just stories with strong narratives, that could be argued against. But I will say Dostoevsky has spent time in prison, so he has first-hand experiences with criminals, but, you know, maybe it is easy to get away with murder. Maybe if you are like Napoleon and you're not quote unquote weak like Raskolnikov, maybe getting away with murder is actually very easy. So let's go back to a real example like Elizabeth Holmes, because she's a real life example. And in one interview with Bill Clinton, she was pressed to answer a question about technology, and towards the end of the interview, she gave an answer that she clearly faked, and the expression on her face looked incredibly desperate.
To some of these solutions.
I almost felt kind of bad for her when I saw this interview, because I wondered what was going through her mind. Did she ever think, was this really worth it? I bet she really wanted to be invisible in that interview, to actually put on the ring, to take the attention away from her, to create even more deception, because she was being called out so much for her lack of virtue or her lack of ability to speak about tech, right? Which was her main focus and her main passion. And it's actually pretty funny because the person sitting next to her was Jack Ma, who was another tech entrepreneur and CEO. And if you look at his facial expressions, he was pretty much laughing or being really confused about what Holmes was saying. And I bet Holmes was really uncomfortable sitting next to him because Jack Ma could clearly see through Holmes's nonsense, right? The way she spoke about things just didn't make sense. And because Jack Ma was an expert in business and tech, he was able to see through her nonsense. And in another interview, when Elizabeth Holmes was asked directly about her company products, she didn't seem all that excited to talk about the details of Theranos, right? There was nothing truly there to talk about. But I also think it's kind of sad that she wasn't passionate about what she talked about, because she spent the entire interview dodging the interviewer's questions. But if you actually look at most interviews with tech entrepreneurs, you know, they're usually really excited to talk about their new technologies, right? They're happy to talk about the new products that they make because there's a real honest and passionate expression coming out of them. That's what makes life so enjoyable. That's what makes life so fun. But if you're Elizabeth Holmes, you can't express this this natural passion and authenticity. And so when I think about her story, I really think that she sold her soul to the devil, that she traded it for wealth and power, and that, trading your soul for wealth and power isn't worth it because you can't be authentic. You can't truly live and enjoy whatever fame and money that you actually get. And that what's most important is not the money and the fame, but the actual products that you create. That's what's more important. Going back to Plato's Republic, it's pretty funny because he creates a blueprint for a totalitarian dictatorship, but to me, I feel like that's unnecessary. You don't need to have a strict control over a city because truth is everywhere, goodness is everywhere, and lies and deception are at the mercy of the truthful and the honest. One employee at Theranos recalled extreme paranoia that ran throughout the company. People rarely had heart-to-heart conversations with one another. There were cameras installed, right? People were being watched. Keystrokes were saved. Emails were monitored. Nothing inside the company could be disclosed to the outside. So it was kind of like a mini totalitarian dictatorship inside the company. And this paranoia strangled the company and destroyed any attempt at real authentic values and virtues. And that's why it led to its collapse. I'd also like to take it a step further because, sure, it can be argued that power and deception is important in business and politics, even though with the examples I gave above, it's clearly not the case. But I think it's really interesting when Green says to never discriminate as whom you study and whom you trust. Never trust anyone completely and study everyone, including friends and loved ones. And it was just crazy to me because are your friends and family really circles of power? Again, business might have a lot of power games, but your family, is this really a place that you want to have, that you want to be deceptive? If your family and friends are deceptive, or you're worried about them being deceptive and not trusting them, I think that should raise gigantic red flags and sounds of blaring alarms. Of course, we should always be cautious about how we trust and who we trust, but applying this calculative mindset to everyone, especially your closest relationships, just sounds nihilistic and empty. These relationships cannot and should not be about power. That would defeat the entire purpose of friends and family, right? Which is about love. Love cannot be experienced when treating friends and family as objects of manipulation. Love is a far more important value and protection from what other value one hopes to attain through deception. So Green may accuse me of trying to assert power by hiding behind love and morality and just trusting your friends, but to me this sounds like projection. Machiavelli, on the other hand, seemed to treat the pursuit of power as a kind of passion. In Machiavelli's biography, one will find that he lived and breathed politics, and he actually collapsed into despair when he was exiled to a farm residence, unable to participate in the political game directly. In a sense, so Robert Greene is right that not having power is miserable, but to me, I think it's if you have the wrong principles, and if you're not looking at the world correctly. I don't have a disagreement with Machiavelli. If someone holds their authentic value to be political power, it would be virtuous to follow the Prince and the 48 Laws of Power. If someone wanted to have complete power and control over everything, if they wanted to be the top dog. But to me, I just think, is being a leader really worth the cost of everything else? Is being the king of hell really something that you want to aspire to? To me, I feel like this is where you're standing on the edge of Mount Doom and you're not throwing the ring in the fire, right? To me, I think you should just leave politics and other places convoluted with power games left to psychopaths and narcissists, right? I think you should leave these places. You should abandon politics. You should abandon shady businesses. You should avoid playing power games with people because I think it's just a race down to the bottom. I think it just creates hell, and it's not worth living in hell. It's much better, as people say, to be a servant of heaven than a king in hell. And so for most of us who don't aspire to be political leaders, I think the characters and examples above show us that even with a little inkling or desire to do evil, even in the pursuit of good, still has disastrous consequences. Even if $100 were left on the table, it's best to avoid... Hey, Marlon. Even with $100 left on the table, it's best to avoid the money altogether, because thinking about stealing and deceiving and manipulating people throws oneself into a dualistic chaos and uncertainty. Robert Greene says that not having power is miserable, and I agree, and it's because people who pursue deceptive power are coming from a place of misery and throw themselves into a psychotic dualism.
Happy people just don't shoot their husbands. They just don't.
When I observe evil, it shows an unwillingness to accept life for what it is. Life isn't embraced but avoided. Instead of pursuing authentic values with a virtuous character, values are achieved by means of deception. In the process of deception, one dehumanizes themselves trying to become God. As I said earlier, when Gollum got the ring, he devolved into some kind of wretched creature. He, in a sense, lost his humanity. There's a book by Hannah Arendt called Eichmann in Jerusalem, The Banality of Evil. Obviously, this caught my attention because it completely contradicted my view of supervillains. What? Evil is banal? If you don't know who Eichmann is, he was a Nazi official responsible for transporting Jews across Europe to be slaughtered in death camps. Many people immediately deemed him to be an utter monster, but when Arendt said that his evil was banal, it was certainly controversial. It flies in the face of how we typically see evil. This was no mastermind or supervillain like in the movies. It wasn't a Sauron or a Darth Vader. It was a rather ordinary man. She says this because she observed his constant use of cliches and an inability to think from another person's perspective. He wasn't motivated by anything else other than advancing his career. Eichmann pleaded innocent because he was merely following orders and doing his duty. It wasn't like he was creating this master plan to kill the Jews. In fact, he never actually hated the Jews. And that's what's so shocking about Eichmann, is that this rather ordinary man with no real malicious intent was still able to literally kill millions of human beings while at the same time not feeling responsible. Arendt at the very end of the book mentions the issue of abstractions. And so when I think about the ring of Gyges, or the ring in The Lord of the Rings, it could represent the Nazi machine that made people invisible and ultimately dehumanized. In other words, Eichmann wasn't the monster exactly. It was the system that reduced human beings to numbers on pieces of paper. Eichmann was able to fill out the paperwork without suffering any of the consequences, right? In other words, he was immune from consequences, since the Jews he sent to death were invisible to him, and at the same time he was invisible to the Jews. These atrocities were able to be committed because the world was rendered meaningless and inauthentic, a combination of symbols and abstractions devoid of real human beings. And so after reading this book, it just makes me think that, when we watch supervillains on TV, we have an incredibly romanticized and distorted view of what evil looks like. Evil is probably your next door neighbor. Evil is probably pretty ordinary. You're probably evil without even intending to be evil. You could be like Eichmann without even realizing it. In fact, in my own experience, I feel like Eichmann when I go to university, when I go to college, because the entire system is so large and looming devoid of authenticity. The classes feel so meaningless and pointless. The degree on the piece of paper is a symbol representing the knowledge that I've supposedly accumulated, but it's still just a symbol. My knowledge is acquired regardless of a degree, but I go to school anyway because the world has convinced itself that the degree is more important than the knowledge itself. It feels very much like rising up the ranks and being held responsible for doing one's duty. The monstrous machine of universities or institutions or generalities are devoid of any real authenticity, of any real value, and at the same time have grown out of ugly proportion. It also reminds me of the days when I used to hack Mario Kart Wii. With these hacks, I felt like a god because it gave me limitless power to wreak havoc on the game. Okay, so I just briefly wanted to mention that I don't have any footage of me hacking, unfortunately, because I didn't have a capture card at the time. But I do have some really old footage where I hacked the game so badly that the game froze, and I recorded the frozen game. So I spammed blue shells, bombs, bananas, bullet bills, everything I could possibly think of. Any item in the game I could use at will. But within a short period of time, I discovered that being a god of Mario Kart rendered the game boring and meaningless. Winning races ceased to matter because I was always guaranteed to win, either by spamming bullet bills or simply pressing a button that would award me first place, even if I got last place. The only interesting left to hacking was trolling other people online. In fact, I trolled people so bad that people would just quit the race before it even started because they knew immediately that I would bomb them endlessly. And this made the game nihilistic, empty, and boring. I remember one last-ditch attempt to actually enjoy hacking the game when I was hacking with my friend. For some reason, we got the idea to troll Japanese people. We were Americans, so we were denied access to a certain game mode that only allowed Japanese people to play. But since we hacked the game, it allowed us to play these Japanese races for Japanese people. And to be extra funny, we named our character names Japan Sucks. Of course, in hacked letters that were jarring and colorful. So in these races, we pretended to play legit, but we would slowly increase our item hacks. Every now and then, we would hack a blue shell or a bomb and sarcastically say, "Oops, a blue shell was thrown in the air. How did that happen?" Or, "Oh wow, a bomb just popped out of me. That's so strange." And we were laughing our asses off because, we were using hacks secretly, right? Like we felt like supervillains. Like, ha ha ha, we're winning these races and these people don't even know we're hacking. Like it felt, it gave us a thrill. But over time, our hacking spun out of control until it became an absolute war zone, right? It was like Mario Kart Wii turned into Call of Duty or something, right? It was like the ring was presented in front of us, and for a while we were able to abstain from it, but eventually we gave into the power of the ring and just used it as much as possible. Looking back on this memory, I do feel a bit ashamed because we were trolling people and, hacking Japanese people. But in our defense, we were teenagers and it wasn't really a big deal because it was just a video game. But when I do think about on this memory, it kind of shows it shows how meaningless the whole thing was, because not only were we playing video games for hours, which is already kind of meaningless, but we were hacking a video game and rendering the game unplayable because we hacked so much. And it just became absurd. It just became ridiculous. Like, it just didn't make any sense anymore. Going back to Dr. Faustus by Christopher Marlowe, he does something very similar with his godly power. And this scene was incredibly funny because Dr. Faustus decided to play tricks on the Pope by snatching his dishes, right? So like when the Pope would go to take a drink, the drink would just start floating and the Pope would be like, "Oh my God, what is going on?" I mean, I don't know why. It's not that funny, but I don't know. It's kind of funny, I guess. When I read this scene, it's interesting because you'd think if you sold your soul to the devil and you have all the power in the world, you would spend that time doing something better, right? Instead of playing tricks on the Pope. And I think what the scene tells us is that not only is giving into deceptive power kind of reducing human beings to objects that you play with for shits and giggles, but it also shows you how having this power doesn't allow you to do anything meaningful with it, right? The more of this deceptive power you accumulate, the less you can actually change the world for the better, the less of an impact you have on it in an ironic way. And then there's another scene where Faustus wanted a wife, and so he used his powers to summon one, except a hot whore appeared instead. Again, Dr. Faustus is a pretty old play. I mean, it was written in the early modern era. The book actually says hot whore. But Faustus is just like, what side is this? And the demon that helped him summon the hot whore made excuses about how marriage is a silly game and you don't want a marriage with a wife, you actually want a hot whore. And it just shows how having great power doesn't actually bring us what we want, or we settle on false or fake values at the expense of real ones. And so going back to Mario Kart, what's interesting is that I completely stopped hacking because hacking Mario Kart never produced any authentic values. What I actually found most meaningful in Mario Kart were playing games in which everyone played legit and relied on their skills, right? They relied on their virtue of playing Mario Kart well. Even when I lost these races playing legit, these were the most fun and the most meaningful because it was a true test of skill, right? It was really something that mattered. And this was especially true when I achieved a time trial of 2 minutes, 12 seconds, and 21 milliseconds on Bowser's Castle in 2014. I know this is a video game and it's really nerdy and stuff. This was a huge achievement for me because out of all the people that played Mario Kart Wii in the United States, my time was in the top 10 fastest times. Felt like a huge accomplishment, especially because there's a shortcut on Bowser's Castle that is incredibly hard to do. It took a tremendous amount of time and practice to be able to do it. So when I was finally able to do it and to do it consistently to get the desired time trial for Bowser's Castle, it felt like I actually achieved something authentic, right? It felt meaningful. It felt like this actually mattered, right? If I hacked this time trial, and many people did hack their times, it wouldn't have mattered at all, right? Because you're just pushing a button. And some people may interject and say that the shortcut is a glitch, right? It's a form of cheating. It's a form of evil deception. And I can understand why someone would think that, but I'd argue that it depends on your authentic values. And this is kind of why morality can be kind of gray and why authenticity can be hard to navigate because, you know, how do you know what's truly authentic and meaningful? I think it's something you ultimately have to decide for yourself. And to me, I think it was an authentic value because not only did I have to work hard for it, but in the Mario Kart Wii community, especially amongst the most competitive players, it was considered respectable and admirable to pull off this shortcut rather than seen as a form of cheating. That's why the Mario Kart community actually developed an entire system dedicated to recording timed trial times that were achieved without hacking. Because if you went through the normal screen, all of the times wouldn't be real times because people hacked it. So the community created a website separately where you could actually look up legit times where people had to submit proof and evidence that they achieved this time legit. And considering the fact that we're talking about hacking in video games, this can be broadly applied to the internet. The internet to me is like the one ring broken up into millions and millions of pieces and dispersed to everyone that participates, right? Everyone is granted anonymity, which means freedom from consequences. Everyone is ridiculously powerful with knowledge at their fingertips. Everyone has influence over each other, yet is disconnected and alienated from one another. Using the internet turns us into a kind of god, which is also dehumanizing and alienates us from ourselves, right? We're all isolated gods when we use the internet. And on a side note, so many people watch porn on the internet as a kind of substitute for real, authentic sex. And to me, this is kind of the same as Dr. Faustus summoning a hot whore instead of a wife, right? So, like, the internet allows you to have this fake value of sex by watching porn. And the same way that Dr. Faustus is convinced that he wants a hot whore, watching porn on the internet is kind of like convincing you that you like porn better instead of a real, authentic relationship, right? And I think that's why the internet is kind of evil, because it forces us or convinces us to pursue phony values over real values. And especially on the internet, everyone fights, right? Everyone on the internet fights to be seen, but at the same time, everyone's invisible, right? Because the ring makes you invisible. No one is actually seen for their authentic selves. Everyone is seen for who they are not. Everyone seems to think that if they become more dramatically deceptive, right, by like posting filtered photos on Instagram or showing how beautiful their life is on Facebook, they'll somehow be seen as a human being, but it does the exact opposite. You know, when Frodo puts on the ring, he's invisible to real human beings around him, but he becomes so utterly visible to Sauron, which is the Great Eye. The internet is like the Great Eye watching over everyone. It's an inverted, corrupt form of visibility. People strive for values but never get them because it's all fake. There's an endless amount of meaningless abstractions on the internet. And similarly to hacking Mario Kart made me a demon because I trolled people endlessly with bombs, people on the internet become demons. There are mountains of evidence showing how humans hurt each other and attack each other online over such petty things. This kind of deceptive power is wasted on trivialities and petty things, right? The same way that Faustus played tricks on the Pope by taking his wine glass. People on the internet pursue petty, trivial, fake, vain, shallow, unthinking, narcissistic, and ultimately inauthentic values. The internet is truly a kind of hell. It is the ultimate machine of dehumanization, converting human beings and values into abstractions and symbols to be manipulated and played with by false gods. You know, given everything I've said so far, the idea that nihilism is evil, that deception is evil, how humans are becoming gods online by means of deception, the idea of focusing on one's authentic values and virtues, I feel like Friedrich Nietzsche has a vital role in this conversation, especially because of his concept of the Superman, right? He said that man will be like apes to the Superman, which makes me think, is the Superman a kind of god? The use of technology and the internet and the glorification of supervillains like Darth Vader and Lord Sauron seems to run dangerously close to the concept of the Superman in all the wrong ways. And so I just wonder, would Nietzsche approve of the internet and the One Ring? Would he approve of Lord Sauron taking morality into his own hands and pursuing his will to power? It's hard to know, especially because I've barely started to read Nietzsche. For this essay, I've only read Beyond Good and Evil. I thought it was an appropriate book since it feels very much like going beyond good and evil, right? Because how do you determine authentic values from inauthentic values? How do you know when abandoning the traditional morals is a good or bad thing? But unfortunately, I have only understood about 30% of Beyond Good and Evil, so I'll have to set Nietzsche aside to unpack for later in future essays. But Nietzsche did say that God is dead, and so I'd like to talk about God for a little bit. I think people have attempted to usurp him and will continue to usurp him now that religion is kind of falling away or religion isn't taken as seriously anymore. I've often heard the criticism from conservatives that not believing in God results in people projecting God onto other areas like the state and ideology, or especially themselves. And to me, I think the idea of God is evil personified. God is the most general abstraction. He's the greatest manipulated symbol. He's the biggest anti-value value and the most powerful anti-identity identity. He has all the power in the world to do whatever he wants, yet is completely invisible. Right? He's never held accountable for his actions unless they are perceived to be good. He was the first ring bearer and the one to wear the ring more than anyone else, but he will certainly not be the last. As time moves forward and with the creation of technology, I believe that humans will start to wear the one ring more themselves, and they will dehumanize themselves in the process as they aspire to be like God. Even in more traditional forms of evil, like the robber or the thief, what does he wear? He wears a face mask. A face mask so people can't figure out his identity. In other words, when people hide their face, they become more godlike and more anonymous and have more power, but they also reduce their humanity because you can't actually look at them in the eye. Can't really identify them. And so when I look up to the great supervillains on TV, I essentially worship them as gods. It was a mistake to believe that I loved them as human. All of the supervillains, like when you think of like a lot of great evil characters, they've all lost their humanity in some way. Basic human activities have ceased to be possible for them. Right? Like imagine sitting next to Darth Vader, Sauron, or Lord Voldemort and trying to have a drink with them. The simple act of eating and drinking is beneath them. They are too powerful for that, too alien for that. They're like gods. They're not human beings that you can talk to. But this is also what makes them so captivating. This is why we worship gods, because, without an identity, being deprived of a human face, enveloped in mystery, spurs our imaginations and projections. Anything could happen and could be under the mask, the suits that these villains wear. When I look at them, it's almost as if I could be one of them. Because anyone can put on a dark suit and mask and look badass. Like, it's a fact. Like, if you wore Darth Vader's outfit, you would feel much cooler. Or Lord Sauron's armor. Like, you would just feel so cool. You'd feel like a god because they look like gods. And it's so easy to convince ourselves that we are special, powerful, and meant for greatness when we look at these characters. These narcissists and psychopaths are inverted versions of Nietzsche's Superman, especially leaders like Napoleon and Hitler. And one common theme you see with these leaders is that they have a belief in their specialness, that they were meant to do something great, which is interesting because Nietzsche praises Napoleon in good and evil, which makes me wonder what the Superman actually is, if the Superman is even a good thing. Anyway, you can see that these evil people would really put on a show, and it would be very dramatic, right? Napoleon crowned himself as emperor as though it were a theater play, convincing everyone that he was somehow above being human. Hitler was convinced he would do something great by a religious figure to help him with his eyesight. Hitler spoke dramatically, playing to people's emotions, was the very first to use the newest technology, used all kinds of symbols and the manipulation of symbols within the Nazi ideology. Elizabeth Holmes modeled herself after the famous Steve Jobs by the way she held up her blood stick, lowered her voice to sound more manly, wore turtlenecks just like him, and even the idea of dropping out of college the first semester as if she was gonna change the world. You can affirm that powerful people are dramatic because Robert Greene says in the 48 Laws of Power, where 4 laws explain this behavior. Law number 27 says to create a cult-like following. Law 32 says to play to people's fantasies. Law 34 says to act royal in your own fashion. And Law 37 says create compelling spectacles. If you follow these laws, if you put on a show, you will gain some kind of power. In my monster essay, I said that Elliot Rodger essentially became a monster because he fell on two extremes of taking responsibility and taking no responsibility. On one extreme, he took no responsibility by placing all his happiness on winning the lottery, hoping that with a lot of money he would be able to attract a beautiful girlfriend. On the other extreme, he took too much responsibility, elevating himself to a god when he took the lives of innocent people. Not only did Elliot Rodger fail to take responsibility as a human being, but he created a delusional narrative placing himself as a victim. He reminds me a lot of Anakin Skywalker, who was the previous version of Darth Vader, in his melodramatic moments. They both talk about how unfair life is, yet Elliot Rodger and Anakin Skywalker are the most fortunate and privileged people to ever exist. Right? When Anakin is the youngest Jedi to ever participate in the Jedi Council, which is a great honor, instead he's infuriated because he thinks it's unfair that he's not granted the rank of Master.
How can you do this? This is outrageous. It's unfair. How can you be on the council and not be a master?
And similarly with Elliot Rodger, one only has to watch one or two of his videos to see how fake and delusional he was.
I've been doing a lot of thinking about how sad and unfair my life has been.
Just because he wanted to, just because of the story in his head. It's very strange to see him twisting and distorting the truth so much to convince himself and everyone else that injustice was being done to him. It almost makes me wonder if people that are the most outraged from injustice are actually the most unjust people themselves, right? Rodger's videos, along with his manifesto and school shooting, truly is nihilistic and inauthentic, right? Because every single video reeks of fakeness and deception. What all these people, in their desire for power, not just Elliot Rodger, but evil people in general, is that there's a common refusal to accept the mundanity and normalcy of existence. And so they put on this show, right? Their life is a demonstration, a monster show devoid of meaning and trying to pretend to be something, a conglomeration and continuous manipulation of symbols, props, cliches, slogans, anti-identity abstractions, and reducing human beings into objects to suit one's narcissistic narrative. In my monster essay, I also briefly mentioned how furries are like monsters. Wearing a fursuit hides one's face, which renders a person less human in a way, and it kind of makes me wonder if being a furry is giving into nihilism and deception, ultimately evil. In fact, this video in itself makes me wonder, since not only am I using the internet, I'm also not showing my face. I'm expressing myself through my furry avatar. Right? There's a hint of anonymity here. There's a sense of not being accountable for my actions. And with a YouTube channel and, in YouTube in general being filled with influencers, it's like these people are putting on a show. It feels like I'm putting on a show. And so I wonder if I'm being evil. One of the main reasons I think I was attracted to being a furry was because life was quote unquote too much for me. I remember always wearing a hat and glasses and noise-canceling headphones everywhere, especially in middle school and high school. Not even necessarily to listen to music, but just to block out the noise, to shield myself. I hated noises, especially loud noises, and I didn't really like talking to people. Right? School was overwhelming. It overloaded my senses, and it hurt my peace of mind. And in a weird way, it contradicts what Socrates said at the very beginning, that one needs the virtue of ears to hear. And wearing headphones is a kind of vice because it blocks out sound. Wearing a fursuit to me is is an attempt to dehumanize myself, to sever contact with the outside world and other people, to filter the world into bigger abstractions so that it's easier to manipulate. This helped elevate me to a godlike status, right? Because it made me feel more confident. I didn't feel as revealed or vulnerable, right? The noises weren't so jarring and intense, and my self-awareness was weakened, which allowed me to hold eye contact with people longer. It allowed me to speak more boldly and more fluently. It's like my entire existence became much more bearable and therefore more powerful, and all I had to do was dim my immersive experience as a human being to decrease my humanity. Wearing headphones, and by extension being a furry, is like wearing the One Ring or becoming a supervillain. And I also think that's the reason why people on the internet can be so bold and say such horrible things and do such horrible things, because they see themselves as supervillains dressed in black and sexy costumes. This is all under the guise of art. People think I'm listening to music, not blocking them out. People think I'm expressing myself artistically as a furry, not hiding myself from life. And so I just really wonder, is there any harm in it? Is this a healthy escape from the rawness of life? And this brings me to the question, is art a healthy form of deception, a healthy form of nihilism, or a kind of evil that is okay? It's interesting because in the Republic, Plato banned all poets in his ideal city. He feared the misuse of knowledge, and I guess by extension, propaganda and deception, as he should be, because, as I said, deception is evil. And even in another dialogue called Ion, which was the first dialogue I read by Plato, Socrates questions whether or not poetry is actually true knowledge, and what is actually happening when we read poetry. Are we getting anything real out of it? Or is it a kind of deception or delusion? And ultimately I would think, what is it that we're doing when we're consuming art? Because when you look at a painting, it's an illusion, right? You get the feeling that it's a 3D world when it's actually a 2D world. For this essay, I watched the Lord of the Rings series front to back, and it was crazy because I watched behind the scenes of making the Lord of the Rings film, and you come to discover that all of the war scenes were used with artificial intelligence. All of the scenes were actually created with props and sets, right? These weren't real places. The part with Rivendell, the entire background is just a painting, even though it feels very real, and we treat the story as very real. In fact, I even used a lot of stories. I used Lord of the Rings as evidence for my argument against evil. And so when I think about art, one of the great purposes of it is that it allows us to have our values without having them. It's like having one's cake and eating it too. It is the middle ground in which someone gives up some authenticity of a value in exchange for a less real version of the value they are looking for. So while the evil people I mentioned earlier engaged in deception in real life, I think they would have had a much greater success by putting deception in its proper place in the world of art. Art is deception, and I think that when we find ourselves desiring power over people or wanting values and not being able to have them, when we're desperate for a value that we really need, we should take a step back and ask ourselves, what art can we create? Maybe it's time to compose a song, paint a painting, or write a story. Art also allows us to be evil without being evil, right? It allows us to experience evil without actually being evil, right? Admiring and loving Darth Vader allows us to connect with evil in a way that's safe and acceptable, as opposed to looking at Eichmann, who is a very real form of evil, or Hitler, who is a very real form of evil. Art allows us to experience dark fantasies. It allows us to imagine what it would be like to be a serial killer, to get in the mind of a serial killer, as an example, without actually having to experience the consequences of being a serial killer, right? Art is like putting on the ring of power in a safe way. And it's also very interesting since Hitler, Napoleon, Elizabeth Holmes, Elliot Rodger, I mean, it's kind of an arbitrary and random set of powerful people or people who desired power. But I think they would have been successful as artists. You know, Hitler, for example, started out as a painter. His first passion in life was to be a painter. And when he failed, he turned to the art of politics. And what led to his success was his ability to speak and appeal to people's emotions, right? Watching his speeches, it's easy to imagine as though he's performing in a play or putting on a show for people, right? It's like you're going to a show more than anything. I would go to one of his shows if he wasn't a true Nazi, obviously, but I feel like it would be quite enjoyable to listen to him speak if it wasn't in the real world of politics and if it was more of an art piece, right? People often compare Donald Trump to Hitler, which is a bit ridiculous in my opinion, but I think the common theme between them is their acting. You know, after all, Trump was a TV personality, and since politics is a game of deception anyway, it's no wonder that these artistic types do very well in politics, since there isn't really much of a difference between them. I think Trump's popularity can be attributed to the basic fact that he's just interesting. To use Trump's language, he is much more interesting than Sleepy Joe, who is very old and boring, while Trump is he's just absurd and ridiculous, right? He's almost funny. It's like, what is this guy saying? You know, he's putting on a show for you. He's a demonstration, and I think that's what made him so popular. Elizabeth Holmes failed because she created her product in healthcare, but since Silicon Valley is known for its leading progress in technological innovation, and since technology turns the world into easily manipulated abstractions and symbols, I bet she would have succeeded if she would have just focused purely on tech, if she wanted to create some kind of an app. And if not that, she would have done amazing as a politician, since her answers in interviews were obviously awful for a tech geek CEO, but as a politician, she would have done absolutely great. Her answers would have been totally satisfactory. Even Elliot Rodger wanted to be a writer at some point. And, you know, I think he would have done pretty good because he was able to create a narrative of his own life where he was this incel hero, where he was this victim, when all evidence pointed to the contrary. And interestingly, Elliot Rodger loved the Game of Thrones series, and what is the Game of Thrones all about? It's all about power games. Too bad the book went over his head, because when I saw the Night King at the very end of, you know, Game of Thrones, when the Night King arose and the Night King had control over all of these zombies, I interpreted that as death was coming. So while all of these people in the light, all of these human beings were fighting over each other for dominance and power and exploiting one another, death was coming to take over. And to me, the message of Game of Thrones is that we should focus on living and being authentic, because we're all going to die anyway. And if we're going to die anyway, we really want to make sure our life is meaningful and not wasted playing games. So even though I think evil can be found anywhere, even though there's manipulative games being practiced all the time, and the pursuit of authentic values is incredibly difficult to navigate, can be gray and confusing, that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. It's important to not sacrifice our most authentic values for false values. Otherwise, we run the risk of dragging ourselves down to hell, sometimes literally. This temptation almost always reveals a desire to become God, resulting in an ostentatious and ridiculous demonstration depicting the loss of our humanity as we give in to nihilism. A nihilism that renders the world meaningless. Values are falsely obtained by the manipulation of symbols and abstractions, rather than by the immersive life experience of practicing one's virtues. It really boils down to how important the virtue of honesty and integrity is. We need to be honest with ourselves, with what we truly find authentically meaningful, what we truly value, and we need to have integrity in the pursuit of our values. When I glitch on Bowser's Castle, when I take that shortcut that wasn't intended by the original game developers, right? Am I being inauthentic? I think I was being honest because I actually had to work really hard for it. And in many ways, I felt like a Superman because I was creating my own value, creating meaning out of it. And I think a lot of casual players, a lot of people who weren't very good at the game would look at me and be like, oh, see, he's just cheating. He's just, he's just cheating and beating me in a way that isn't real, But I actually think they're the ones that are inauthentic. They're the ones that aren't real because they're not skilled enough to actually learn the shortcut, to learn the glitch. They're kind of like sheep, right? They don't know how to create values of their own. They play the game how the original game developers intended it. But I also think when we create our own values, no one else can hold us accountable. Only we can hold ourselves accountable. And it can be very easy to go from pursuing authentic values that aren't the norm to completely hacking the game and rendering it meaningless again. And I feel like it's about finding that balance, finding your own way. And, Nietzsche talked a lot about suffering and how, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, that going through a lot of suffering is what gives a lot of value to our joys in life. Nietzsche experienced a lot of sickness in his life, and every time he came out of those sick moments, those periods of sickness, he would become so grateful and so happy just for having his health. And so I think when it comes to being our true selves and becoming ourselves and wanting to live a full life, it's about embracing suffering. It's about embracing things that truly matter to us and being willing to suffer, being willing to embrace the pain of pursuing things that matter to us. But I also think that the world can be a lot to deal with. It can be hard. Reality is hard and cruel and cold. And I think that's where art comes in, where if we want something and we can't have it, we can get it through art. We can achieve our values through art, not dividing yourself into a dualistic misery, but right, being disintegrated. It's about uniting yourself, integrating yourself, bringing things together, being able to, feel full and real, but not so full and real that it overwhelms your experience in the world.